Hey everybody, welcome back to another video here at homerecordingmadeeasy.com and here on my YouTube channel. And this week we're going to take yet another look at another one of the Presonus Fat Channel XT compressor plugins. We're going to look at the classic compressor this week, and we're going to compare it sonically to the standard old compressor, the stock compressor that comes along with Studio One. I'm going to kind of give you a little lesson, a little ear training on what the differences are and why it's a good idea to have multiple types of compressors in your arsenal. And the good news is, if you're a Studio One owner, these all come part of Studio One. But before we get to that, if you like what you see in this video, hit that subscribe button, also the notification bell, so you know when I post new content. Also, if this is your first time here, why don't you go out to homerecordingmadeeasy.com. I want to give you a $100 free mixing course right on the homepage. Click the orange button, download that course. It's my gift to you just for visiting homerecordingmadeeasy.com. And if you stick around to the end of the video, I'm going to give you another free gift, especially as we talk about compression. So here we are in Studio One. So if you missed the video last time where we talked about the stock compressor and compared it to the FET Comp 76, the 1176, that link will be in the description box below. Go check out that video. And this week we're going to take a look at the classic compressor. Now, Fat Channel XT is something that comes with all versions of Studio One. Now, if you have the artist version or the professional version, you may have a few more extra plugins inside of the Fat Channel from one version to the other. If you are a Presonus Sphere member, whether you pay monthly or annually, you're going to have all of the plugins inside of the Fat Channel XT. So inside of the Fat Channel XT, we have right down here, we have our compressor section. Now, the ones that come free with any version of Studio One are the standard compressor, the tube compressor, and the FET compressor, which we looked at last week. Those three come for free as part of the standard package. All these other compressors that you see here in my list, these are all paid options. And if you are a Presonus Sphere member, these are all included for free as well. And hopefully over the next several weeks, as I compare all of these compressors to our normal stock compressor that comes with every version of Studio One, you'll start to hear the sonic differences of why it may be a good idea to have some of, if not all of these other compressors at your disposal, because you will use them in different applications. So again, this week, we're going to talk about the classic compressor. Okay. So as I said above here, the stock compressor comes with every version of Studio One. It's a basic standard compressor. Now, for beginners here, this is more of a kind of a beginner's course here. Again, last week we talked about, well, what is compression? Well, compression, very simply put, is a way to control dynamic range of a piece of audio. Dynamic range being defined as we have a piece of audio that has low points in volume and high points in volume. The distance between the low and the high, that's called dynamic range. What a compressor does is, as you compress audio, the more you compress audio, the lows come up and the highs go down, and it evens out the performance and gives it a little bit more consistency. That is the basic 1,000 or 25,000 foot view of what a compressor really does. Okay, there's a lot more to it, but for this video, we're going to stay really, really basic. That's what every compressor does. It compresses audio, it controls dynamic range. The other thing that a compressor can do for you when you start talking about these different types of compressors that are modeled after analog pieces of gear, classic pieces of gear like the classic compressor, is they can also imprint a sonic tonal difference to your audio, meaning it can give a little bit of an EQ shaping difference. It can add a little bit of harmonic distortion, a little bit of color, a little bit more vibe, and all those juicy words that we talk about when we talk about classic analog hardware, and now on the classic analog style plugins that Presonus has done so brilliantly in modeling and has made it part of Studio One. So there's a difference. And what I want to do here in this video and over the next several weeks is kind of show you the differences. And we're going to listen to, well, what does the standard compressor sound like? And how does that compare to something like the classic compressor? So let's start with the standard compressor. So the standard stock compressor that comes with every DAW, and this one in particular in Studio One, has all the different controls and usual suspects that you would see on most compressors, although every compressor will have fewer or more controls depending on the plugin. This one is pretty full featured. We have a threshold or ratio in Neve, a graphic display so we can see what's kind of going on here, an attacker release in the envelope section, a makeup gain section over here to the right. We have a global mix knob, which we're going to keep on 100% wet. And then we have a side chain, which we're not going to talk about for this video. Now, if you want to learn all about compression in a very non-technical way, and you are someone that's new to compression, I want to invite you to check out homerecordingmadeeasy.com and check out my course, Compressor Made Easy, where we spend 3 hours and you get audio files, and we do tons of ear training exercises, all done in Presonus Studio One, and we talk about this particular compressor among as well as third-party compressors, what the difference is on, so on and so forth. And like I said at the end of the video, I'm going to give you a discount on that course or any course on my website, so stick around. So we're going to kind of gloss over some of the basics here. If you really want to get into the basics, you really got to go check out that course. However, so here's our standard compressor. And I have this playing on an acoustic guitar bus for now, just an acoustic guitar with no EQ. Let's listen to that acoustic guitar with no compression whatsoever. Both of these compressors are in bypass here. Let's just listen to what that acoustic guitar, heavily strummed guitar sounds like. So here's the audio we're going to be working with this week. Okay, so that is the audio we're going to be working with, and I like using a really heavily, aggressively strummed acoustic guitar because it makes hearing the compressor actually working a little bit more obvious here. So on our standard compressor, the way I have this basically set up is we're using a 4:1 ratio. We're compressing about 10 dB or so because it's such a heavily strummed guitar. We're using a pretty fast attack and a pretty fast release here. When I unbypass it here, and the bypass button is up here in orange, so when it's orange, it means it's in bypass mode. When it's in gray, it means it's enabled. Listen to the difference as I bring in this compressor, how it kind of, and listen for the really beginning of where he's really hitting the strings. He's really hitting really hitting the heavy strums. You hear that a pick attack on the strings. Listen to what happens when we engage the compressor. Okay, so hopefully you can hear the difference here. You can see down here in the gain reduction meter here, we're doing anywhere from -8 to about -10, depending on how hard the part is being played. I can reset that just by clicking on it there with my mouse. Now, again, when you engage the compressor, hopefully you can hear, and we'll listen to that again if you weren't sure what to listen for, or if you didn't hear a difference. I want you to hear that where he's getting really heavy on the strings. It's usually on the ones, usually on the downbeat. Okay, listen for the heavy strums. With the compressor enabled, you should hear that the transients, the attack of the pick on the strings, that initial on the downbeat doesn't poke through as heavily. It evens out that performance a little bit. Even though it's a very dynamically played part, it tends to tame the initial transient just a little bit. Listen for that. So it's on the downbeat. You can hear the heavy strums. So here's without the compressor. Okay, here comes the compressor. So those, it doesn't poke out so much, right? Without the compressor, it really jumps ahead of you, okay? So that's what this compressor does. It compresses audio. It evens out the performance. The more compression we do, the more it's going to tame it. The less compression we do, the more dynamic it's going to be. And we'll talk about how you should be doing it in the context of a mix and all of that in a later video. This is just so you guys can actually hear what's going on with the compressor. So we know, if you didn't hear that, stop the video, rewind it, and go back and listen to that section a few times, because it's important that you learn to train your ears to focus in on that piece. That's the first step, the first hurdle to overcome, is can you hear what that compressor is doing? And it is fairly subtle to someone that's new. Someone who has trained ears would say, wow, I could really hear it. It's very obvious. But to most people, it's not obvious. And if you're having a hard time hearing it, it's okay. It takes time to learn how to hear compression. And we all, every one of us, had to learn how to listen for it, and it's through repetition, okay? Nobody has magic ears that understood it the first time they heard it. Trust me, no matter what anyone on YouTube tells you. Okay, so that's what this compressor does. Controls dynamic range. Now, aside from that, well, let's jump now to the classic compressor, and then we'll get back to my other thought here. So the classic compressor, this is in bypass mode now, the standard one. We have the same kind of controls, few less controls here. This is modeled on a Neve-ish style. Looks like a Neve-ish style. Presonus can't say that, but I can say that because I don't work for Presonus. So it's modeled on a Neve style compressor, old classic piece of gear. We have a threshold, a recovery, which is our release time. We have our ratio and our gain. Okay, our makeup gain. Okay, that's what we have going on here. Okay, so now the more compression that we don't have an attack time here, the attack time is kind of under the hood, if you will. So again, the goal here is not that we're going to have the exact attack and release on each one of the compressors. We won't be able to do that. What I wanted to get across to you is how they sound a little different from each other. So we're going to use a 4-to-1 ratio, same as the other compressor. We're going to use about the same recovery time or the release time. The attack time we can't control, and we're going to try to achieve about the same amount of compression, around 8 to 10 dB. So here is, I'll start with it off, and then I'll bring it in down here, and you'll be able to hear the classic compressor. Here we go. Okay, now that we know what to listen for, I'm going to go back to the beginning of this loop and I'm going to turn it on and off. Bypass is orange, remember. Bypass on and off, on and off, on and off through this loop so you could kind of hear what's going on. Again, listen for that heavy strum. Listen for the downbeat because that's where you're going to try to hear it the most. And just try to listen for how it kind of controls the transient or controls that initial pick attack. Here we go. Okay, did you hear the difference? Again, if you didn't, stop the video, go back and rewind it. So once again, same kind of thing. It controls that transient. The more we compress it, and again, I know the compression isn't identical, but it's close enough for this example. We hear that it tames that downbeat, that heavy strum, and where he gets really aggressive, it tends to tame it a little bit more, right? So they both do the same thing. So you may be saying to yourself, well, okay, so what? So why would I use one over the other, Dave? What the hell do I need two of them for if they're both doing the same thing and they both pretty much tame the transient, which is what we wanted to do. It controls the dynamic range. Well, what else should I be listening for? What's the point here? Okay, here's the point. So we're going to go back to the first compressor again. Okay, now you automatically know we're taming the transient. So let's not listen for that. Let's start to train our ears to listen for tone. And when I mean tone, I mean EQ. Do we hear any kind of tonal shift when I turn the stock compressor on and off, other than the fact that it's taming the transient? Do we hear anything in the EQ shift at all? Do we hear it get a little darker, a little brighter, a little more present, a little more, lack of presence? Do we hear any difference? What's the difference? I don't know. Let's listen. We're going to start with it off and turn it on, and we'll go on, off, on, off, on, off. Try to focus more now on the tone or the EQ portion of it. Here we go. Okay, do you hear any difference in the EQ? Now, before and after, the volume is the same, right? It's important that we level match the plugin. And again, that's for another video. Again, compression made easy. That's where you're going to learn all about that. But do you hear any difference in tone? Okay, if you said, no, Dave, I really don't hear it. Should I have heard something different? I don't really hear it. If you've thought that, don't worry, because you're actually right. There really is no difference in tone. It is almost undistinguishable between turning this on and off from a tonal standpoint. You may say, well, why is that? Because a stock compressor such as this is a very transparent compressor. When you hear that word, transparent, what does that mean? Well, that means that from an EQ point of view, it's very transparent, meaning we don't really hear a difference in tone from on and off. We hear a difference from taming the transient. It's a little softer, the transient, a little bit more pokey, right? But from a tonal standpoint, really is no difference. It's a transparent compressor. So if you just want something that just controls dynamic range and you're not looking for any kind of tonal shift, and we'll talk about why you may want that in a minute, then something like a stock compressor does a wonderful job. It does exactly what it says on the tin. It compresses audio. Now, if we go down to the classic compressor, the Neve style compressor, which is modeled after an old analog piece of gear, they have a different tone to them. Before I tell you why that is, let's listen. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go on, off, on, off, on, off. Try to ignore the transient control as much as you want to focus on the tone. Does anything tonally sound different? I don't know. Here we go. We're going to start with it off, and then we're going to go on, off, on, off, on, off. Take a listen. Do you hear any difference? If you don't, stop the video, go back and listen to it again. Focus now on the more present, the more trebly end of the strings, the higher strings. Listen for that. That's where it's most obvious. What you'll hear is that it gets a little bit more present and the upper mids get a little bit more open. And again, I'm talking about subtlety here. It's not like this, someone took the treble knob on your car stereo and turned it from all the way counterclockwise to all the way clockwise. It's not that obvious, okay? So don't worry if you didn't hear that much of a difference. There isn't that much of a difference. There is a subtle difference in the way the upper mids and the top end opens up. It gets a little bit more present. It gets a little bit more, for lack of a better word. That's a technical term, by the way. It gets a little more present. Listen for it again. Here we go. We're going to start with it off and I'm going to bring it in. I'm going to keep it off, bypass for a little bit, and then I'll suddenly bring it on and you should be able to hear the difference. Here we go. Did you hear that time when it's off for a while, then it suddenly comes on, you hear it get a little bit brighter, right? A little bit more present. Again, if you didn't hear that, stop the video, rewind it, go back and listen to it again. It is definitely there. And for my students that are more familiar with compression and have been doing this a while, you're going to say, yes, I hear the difference right away. Okay. So now you say, well, geez, why did we hear that on this compressor, but we didn't hear that tonal difference on this compressor? Because this compressor, this classic compressor, this Neve style compressor, is again modeled wonderfully by Presonus of an old analog piece of gear. And inside of that analog piece of gear, you have things like transformers and capacitors, and in some cases tubes, not this one, different types of circuitry. Okay. And when you run audio signal through a piece of analog equipment or a plug-in that emulates a piece of analog equipment, if it's done well, the circuitry inside of that compressor or that analog piece of gear is going to impart a little bit of a tonal difference onto your audio, and every compressor sounds a little different because all the components are different. The type of compressor that it is different. There's a whole bunch of other variables. And again, that's for the Compression Made Easy course. But for this video, just know that every analog piece of gear and compression and how it was designed and the circuitry and all of that, everyone is different. Therefore, when you run audio through that, different types of circuitry among different types of compressors are all going to sound a little bit different. And you're going to hear words on the internet like vibe and harmonic distortion and warmth or punch, or all those words that we like to use to help describe what the tone is. And you may even have heard the word a compressor. A lot of engineers will call them tone boxes. I've used that term before. Because a compressor is a compressor is a compressor when we're talking about controlling dynamic range. But from a tone aspect, every compressor sounds a little bit different. And depending on the mix and the track and how it was recorded and a bunch of other variables, you may decide to pick one compressor over another because of the way it reacts to the audio, right? And the way it may sound tonally. Okay, so now, the best way to really describe, well, again, we're doing all this in solo. I think this would be a great opportunity to bring in our bass and our drums here. We have some bass and drums, and I got the guitar a little bit louder than the bass and the drums. I'm going to bypass both compressors. Let's just see what this sounds like. Okay, we have an acoustic guitar competing with drums and a bass guitar. And we got a mix that sounds pretty balanced, but we want to use a compressor in this case to how do we get that acoustic guitar to maybe stand out a little bit more. Now, certainly we could just turn it up, but then maybe it's out of balance with the bass and the drums. And we have to compress it because it's a very dynamic played part, right? So we can even out the performance. So we don't have the downbeats shooting way out in front of the drums and the bass. We want it to be more steady, more evenly played, or perceived evenly played, right? So we're going to use a compressor. But we can also at the same time think of that as that compressor as a tone box or kind of a subtle EQ to help it cut through the mix. Let me demonstrate. So right now everything's bypassed. We are going to bring in our stock compressor. Okay, I'm going to leave everything the same way, and I'm just going to turn the stock compressor on and off and hear how it kind of sits with the bass and the drums, both from a compression point of view and now that you know what to listen for from a tonal point of view. Here we go. Okay, so we're turning it on and off again. Tonally, it really doesn't change. It compresses, but it doesn't really change that much. And it gets a little bit lost in the mix. Now let's try that same exercise with this classic compressor here. I bypassed the top one. I'm going to leave it off again. I'm going to go back to the beginning of the loop and I'm going to bring it in and I'm going to bring in that classic compressor. And let's see, does that classic compressor, without changing anything else, did it help it cut through the mix a little bit more? I don't know. Let's find out. Here we go. It's in bypass mode now. Keep your eye on the bypass button. So because this compressor, maybe you heard that, hopefully you heard that. If not, stop the video, rewind it again. Hopefully you've heard again, because this compressor tends to have a little bit more of an upper mid and a little bit more openness there. It helps it sit ahead of the bass and the drums just a little bit. It helps it push it tonally a little bit more in front. It's a little bit more easily heard, right? Whereas on this compressor, we really didn't get that because we have two different styles of compressor here. So this is one of the advantages to having several compressors in your arsenal. And again, if you're a Studio One user and you have the Fat channel here and you happen to be either a Presonus Sphere member, you'll have all these in your collection, or you could buy these also as add-ons as well. It's a good idea to have that because depending on the mix, depending on the instrument and a whole bunch of other factors, you can use a compressor to help shape the tone of your mix. We're only talking about a compressor on one channel here as a one-to-one example. But now imagine this across an entire mix, where you take this kind of a philosophy on drums, on bass, on guitars, on keyboards, on vocals, and now you have maybe 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 of these different compressors spread around your mix, and they're all adding a little bit of a tonal shift, adding a little bit of color, a little bit of a different character. What does that do to your mix? Well, it doesn't make the mix sound so transparent, or in some people would say so clinical or so clean, because when you use just standard stock plugins, that's one of, in my opinion, and many others as well, maybe one of the downsides to only using things like the stock compressor. Is because if you use the stock compressor on everything, it all sounds the same, right? It all has kind of that, that all kind of very clean, very transparent sound, where if you have 4 or 5 of these different compressors sprinkled around the mix, now you have some character and a little bit more of a unique sound, and you can use the compressor as a tone box to help shape or help cut things through the mix a little bit. As opposed to just taking an EQ and boosting the top end, you can use compression in a way to do that in a very subtle and a very musical way. Okay, I hope that makes sense. And so this is another example of the Fat Channel XT, another great compressor, which sounds completely different than what we listened to in the last video, which was the FET 76. And you may want to go back and watch that video so you can compare the two. And what I would encourage you to do is, if you have the Fat Channel XT, you already have, even if you don't have any of the paid plugins like this one is, or even if you are not a Presonus Fear member, you already have in your arsenal the tube and the FET style. Those come free with every version of Studio One when you have the Fat Channel XT, right? So I would do the same kind of exercise on your own, just using these 2 compressors against your stock compressor, and hear the difference. And then you can come back for other videos where we're going to be taking a look at all the compressors that are in the Fat Channel XT by Presonus. So I hope you found this video helpful and you get a little bit more of an inside look and a little more understanding of compression. I know when people are new to listening for compression the first time, it can be very, very difficult, very challenging, and quite honestly, very frustrating. It is one of the most important tools we have as mixers, and it's one of the most misunderstood things we have as mixers, especially people that are new to mixing music. This is why I created the course, Compression Made Easy, out at homerecordingmadeeasy.com. I want you to go check out that course, okay? When you go out to the website and you check out that course, I want to give you a 25% discount coupon code that you can use on not only Compression Made Easy, but any course on my website. The coupon code is YouTube25. If you put that in the checkout, it'll take 25% off any one of the training courses. And if you're a Studio One user specifically, I have 3 courses that are specifically designed on just Studio One and their plugins and how to use the different functionality of Studio One, so on and so forth. There are Studio One specific training, even though all of my training courses on my website are done in Studio One. But most of my courses, like Compression Made Easy, you can apply to any DAW, not just Studio One and their plugins, but anybody's DAW and plugins. But I also have 3 courses that are specific to just Studio One, so you may want to check those out as well. And you can use that coupon code and get 25% off. So let me know below in the comment section, number 1, are you a Studio One user? Number 2, if you are a Studio One user, do you use the Fat Channel XT, and which of the compressors do you have? And number 3, which is your favorite Fat Channel XT compressor? What is it? Which one of the compressors is your favorite you tend to use? And what other struggles do you have with compression that you'd like me to bring you more education on here on YouTube? I'd love to know. Let me know in the comments below. Until the next video, I've been Dave with homerecordingmadeeasy.com. Thank you so very much for watching, and I will see you very soon. Take care, everybody.